The Holy Gospel, according to Matthew, the 14th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by the time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me!" Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." This is the gospel of our Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. When I was a kid, right, I was always told to not walk down a certain street because bad things could happen to me if I went that way. I avoided walking down this certain street because I did not want to get hurt, beat up, or whatever else may befall me if I went down that way, right? So, being the age that I was around 8 to 10 years old, I imagined there were ghosts down this road. And I remember how frightening that street looked at night. It's one of those streets where you walk down and all the street lights are broken. You don't want to go down there. See, I never asked why it wasn't safe at that age to go down there, because I didn't need to. I had been warned. I heard stories from what friends have told me about the things that happened down this road. And I also know that none of my friends went down there either. Sometimes on a dare, one of us would go halfway up that street looking at that one corner. But me, I was always scared, and I never stayed too long just looking at that street. I ran the other way. See, I've since grown out of these fears, right? But I have not outgrown fear itself. I've been in the same boat as the disciples in today's Gospels have been in. Maybe you have too, right? My childhood stories haven't ended. They've just changed. They became adulthood stories. And I suspect that's true for all of us this morning. We all have our own fears, don't we?
Yes, we do.
We all have our own ghost stories, don't we? Regardless of not whether ghosts are real, we know that fear is. You know what I mean, right? I bet each one of you could tell a story about fear in your own life, about a ghost that haunts and frightens you, because there are all sorts of fears and ghosts. We fear our own death and deaths of our loved ones, don't we? We fear the loss of health, security, success, and reputation. We fear COVID-19, the state of our society, the state of our elections. We fear failure and what others will think about us. We fear being out of control and powerless. We fear the unknown, what will happen and what might not happen. And especially in today's climate, we fear finding work or losing our jobs. And how can we keep food on our tables for our families? We also fear other people. Those who look, act, and believe differently than us. And also we fear being enough, but also being found out. See, and this list can go on and on and on, church. And each one of us could add to this list. So what would you put on it? What do you fear? See, I've come to believe that fear is a primary driver and controller of our lives. I've experienced that in my own life, and I've seen it in the lives of others. I've seen how it can take hold of us, distort our vision, and drown our lives. See, fear often determines the choices that we make, the words that we say, the actions that we take, and the prayers that we offer. So we come to today's gospel passage, which is about fear. And about responses to fears, ours and God's. We pick up the story exactly where we left off last week. That long day on which Jesus learned about the death of John, his cousin, and tried to find time apart to pray and be alone, but was thwarted by the large and needy crowds. But remember how he healed them. He took compassion on them. He fed them, along with his disciples. On that day of fear and anxiety, Jesus found it in himself to feed God's hurting and hungry people. Immediately, as Matthew tells us, Jesus told his disciples to get into a boat. Actually, if you read the text, he says he made them get in a boat, which is an odd detail. But it lets us know that Jesus is in charge. The disciples are his followers, and he takes command. Go, he tells them, and they obey. And Jesus finally finds the hours he needs to be alone, to pray and grieve and process the horrifying and beautiful events of the day. We also see the illusion that Matthew sees Jesus as this new Moses. So many of the most important events of Jesus' life are portrayed as taking place on a mountain, right? Like Moses on Sinai. Jesus goes up to the mountain to pray and to commune with God. Jesus is on the mountain. The disciples are in the boat. And time passes. See, Matthew has just described for us the situation of the early church, folks. Jesus, who Matthew has called Emmanuel, God with us, is suddenly, distressingly absent. See, our life, whether it's the church or at our home lives, is a boat. In the middle of a journey, far from land and battered by the waves. Or another word for battered in this translation could be tortured. So we are being tortured by the storm all around it. See, look at the events of today's world, folks, and you'll see fear. It's one thing both sides in any conflict have in common. Listen to the voices in your head and you'll hear that fear. You got one camp that tells you to fear the other. That your race is about to be exterminated in this country. You got to fight for yourselves. Then you have the other side talking about, we've seen what's going on in this country. We've seen it before. We are scared for those who are marginalized and oppressed. We fear dictatorship, right? These are two things going on, two fears that are being played out, duality in our country right now. So we'll see, all these fears are generated, especially in our news today, that is very loud and very talkative. You can't go by the news without turning on a TV channel without somebody spewing some fear. You read the headlines and you'll find nothing but stories of fear. But also, if you study the scriptures, you'll discover that the most common thing God tells his people is, do not be afraid. There's a contrast there, isn't there? And yet, most of us are. We've rowed the same boat as the disciples. We've been tossed about by the storms of life. We've seen the ghost and we've cried out in fear. Have y'all ever felt that the world is drenched in darkness? Have the waves of life ever battered, tortured, and harassed you? Does it sometimes seem like you are rowing against the wind and making no headway? Have you ever found yourself alone, far from land and a safe harbor? See, if you know what that's like, then you'll know what it was like for the disciples in today's gospel. In those circumstances, it is easy to see ghosts, to be terrified, and to cry out in fear. And that's what's happening in our gospel text to the disciples this morning. And it happens to us. It's happening throughout the world. As I said, the world today is crying out in fear. Some will cry out with tears, and some will cry out with screams of horror. Some will cry out with silence. Some cry out through paralysis, not knowing what to say or do. And others cry out with rockets and bombs, don't they? Some cry out with political rhetoric and posturing. And also there are those that cry out in hate. And whatever way we do it as humans, at some point in our lives we all cry out in fear. More often than not, we cry out to be rescued from the circumstances of which we are afraid, don't we? We want to escape the storm and avoid all those ghosts. We want to be picked up and set down somewhere else that is safe, calm, and that's comfortable. But what's crazy about all that is Jesus doesn't do that, does he? Jesus didn't do that for the disciples, and he doesn't do that for us. Instead, Jesus reveals himself, speaks, and comes to the disciples in and from the very midst of the storm itself. He did not take the disciples out of their storm. He entered into their storm. Jesus does not come to us from outside our storms and fears like some divine search and rescue mission. Yet that's often where we look for him now, isn't it? Outside the circumstances of our lives. We are too easily persuaded that the solution to dire circumstances comes only from the outside the circumstances themselves. But that is the exact opposite of what today's gospel tells us. Jesus came to the disciples walking on the water, through the wind, and in the darkness. Jesus' peace, words of comfort, and presence are not outside the storm, but in the eye of the storm, church. So why do we not look for him in that place? In the place of our fear. Because that's where Jesus shows up. But where else would he be? This one we call Emmanuel, God with us. Because if Jesus is not in our storms and fears, then he is not Emmanuel. He is not God with us. So I wonder if we sometimes miss what's really happening in today's gospel. If we all see is a gravity-defying, water-walking Jesus, then we have missed the miracle itself. The wind and the waves are about more than weather conditions, church. They are more descriptive of what is happening within the disciples than what's happening around them. See, the real miracle in the story is that Jesus walks on the storms that brew and rage with inside us. That means divine power and presence have and always will trample on, overcome, and conquer human fear. It means that Jesus is Emmanuel. He is with us in our direst of circumstances. But the disciples could not recognize this. Sometimes we don't either, do we? It's a ghost, they screamed in terror. It's the one thing that made sense to them. Because people don't walk on water, do they? It had to be a ghost. What else could it be? That is the power of fear to deceive, distort, and drown. It makes no sense to think that the very elements that threaten our lives are the same elements from which new life comes. Yet, isn't that the way of the cross? Isn't that the story of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection? Isn't that the good news we so desperately want and need to hear? Isn't that what's happened in today's gospel? See, our storms and fears are the place in which we abandon ourselves to God. Most of us, however, don't do that until we first feel abandoned by God, now do we? Surely that's how the disciples might have felt, right? Jesus made them, compelled them to get into the boat and cross the sea seemingly alone. They had been abandoned to the open sea, the darkness, the waves, the wind, the futility of their own efforts and fantasies and illusions. They were abandoned to their own unself-sufficiency so that they might abandon themselves to God. See, the very elements that threatened to destroy the disciples became the environment in which they recognized Jesus as the Son of God. What they first perceived as certain death, they now recognize as new life, hope, and salvation. See, every time we cry out in fear, Jesus comes to us saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." That's the invitation to abandon ourselves to God in the midst of our own storms and fears. How hard is it to hear and heed those words when the waves are breaking, the wind is howling, and the ghosts are approaching? Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. No matter how high the waves build, they are the waves on which Jesus walks to us. No matter how strong the wind blows, it is the wind through which Jesus walks to us. No matter how dark the night, it is the night in which Jesus comes to us, church. No matter how great our fear, it is the fear that Christ has already trampled and defeated on the cross. When we are afraid and we are wondering what the future holds, our greatest hope is to be in that boat where Jesus' presence makes itself known. When we are afraid, it's the presence of the other, whether it's at home or at the church, that we see the face of God shining through the faces of our friends and our loved ones, that makes the fear bearable now, doesn't it? Even when we are wondering, is this it? Will this be the end for us? The gospel message insists, no, it is not the end. Remember the words of Jesus this morning. Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. Amen.
Amen.